Good afternoon, everyone. I think we'll get started. Thanks for joining us. Welcome to the third of 4 installments in this fall's special edition miniseries of WARF Essential Topics, commemorating WARF's 90th anniversary. I'm Michael Falk, WARF's General Counsel. WARF was established in 1925 to patent and license inventions arising from research at UW-Madison, and in so doing to advance groundbreaking research and graduate education. I would like to thank everyone for joining us today. I see a lot of familiar faces. I also wanted to recognize Representative Eric Genrich of Green Bay, who joined us. Thank you, Representative. We appreciate you joining us today. This fall's forums, including the one we host tonight, are intended to explore what we think of as the 4 pillars of the cycle of innovation. It all starts with research and discovery. In October, we held 2 sessions, and many of you were here to join us for those, on basic research and the process of discovery that often leads to, among other things, intellectual property. Those are both on videotape. I'd encourage you to look at them. And also remember today when we have our Q&A session to wait for a microphone so we can capture that as well. This will be videotaped in case you have a colleague who'd like to see it or enjoy it again. The next essential step in the cycle is commercialization. That's what we're going to talk about today. We've got a number of leading folks from industry that will help us with that conversation, as well as some of our WARF insiders. And finally, there's investment. We're going to have our final of the 4 installments of these talks on November 18th, and we'd really encourage you to join us for that one as well. Before we move to our moderated discussion tonight, I'd like to introduce Kevin Walters. Kevin is a doctoral student here at UW, a historian, and he's writing his dissertation about WARF and has been studying us, and he's going to share a few words about the background.
Thanks, Michael. I'm getting over a little bit of cold, so hopefully my voice will hold up here. So when I've explained this a couple of times in the first 2 presentations, but when we looked at the cycle of innovation historical background, I went and looked at the mission statement that WARF drafted back in 1925, and you find that each part of the cycle is right there in the mission statement. So first time we talked about to promote, encourage, and aid scientific investigation and research. So there's research. To provide or assist in providing the means and machinery by which there's scientific discoveries. So there's discoveries. And then this week, we'll be talking about commercial uses. And the next week, provide funds. So here's that sentence isolated. To developed, applied, and patented in the public and commercial use thereof determined, and by which such utilizations or dispositions may be made of such discoveries, inventions, and processes, and patent rights or interests therein. So what does that sentence mean exactly? This one's a little bit more arcane. There's not only a thereof, but also a therein. And utilization or disposition. It's not entirely clear what that means, but that's actually kind of suitable because I think commercialization is the hardest one to explain and the most complicated to go through of all these processes. So how do we explain that? Well, I thought I'd make a metaphor to a plot diagram. I want to thank the Club Penguin Fan Wiki for this image. I have no idea what that means, but they had the best picture I could find to illustrate this. So if you think about the cycle of innovation as like a plot, the setting and the conflict at the beginning, you're getting your bearings, you're finding out what's out there, then you make a discovery that's going to make a change that might be disruptive, might tell people to do things a little differently, and then you have details, more details before you get to the climax. Commercialization is that details part. Or we might call it complications, to try to get through all of that. And of course, in a plot, if you're a reader, you like those details because it makes the story more exciting, it makes it more interesting. If you're an inventor, it might feel more like you're sinking into despair, which is why the phrase valley of death is going to be a key word when we come up there. So that might explain to you why you get there. So actually, to explain this a little further, the Steenbock discovery, WARF's founding discovery, actually helps illustrate this commercialization process pretty well. So this is the trends and deaths from rickets. So as you probably know, Harry Steenbock invented a process for fortifying foods with vitamin D, and the process helped cure rickets. So rickets was very prevalent, as you see, in the first part of the 20th century, then went down. But I want to focus in a little bit more on when this line actually goes down. You'll notice it doesn't go down in 1924, which is when Steenbock filed for the patent. It doesn't go down in 25 when WARF is founded and he signs his patents. It doesn't go down in 26 when Quaker Oats is given a license to fortify their food with vitamin D. It doesn't go down in the late 20s when there's a drug called Viasterol that WARF licenses. Viasterol is a lot more palatable than cod liver oil, but it's still a medicine and not a food. So what happens in the early 30s that actually does make it go down? Well, what had happened is over the process of about 10 years, WARF had figured out how to put vitamin D into milk. And they figured out that milk was the ideal source. They'd figured out how to do that without, first of all, adulterating the milk by putting an additive in it, which later there were additives that were put into it after this, and also without altering the flavor. As you imagine, the process involved ultraviolet light, so you put milk under heat and light, it tends to change the flavor. So it took them a while to figure out all these processes. In the intervening time, Steenbach and Harry Russell, who was the director, were actually concerned that the Steenbach process might be a failure if they didn't figure out how to make this more widely available. So there was money being made, but it wasn't really getting out into the public realm. So in short, it took about 10 years to get from oatmeal to vitamin D milk. I put a little picture here. This is a milk bottle from the 40s. Actually, thanks to Carrie Tomey for providing this picture from a friend who found it in the flea market. But this is a milk bottle, and these little certifications, WARF seal of approval, were on vitamin D milk there. So what were some of the concerns that the trustees and Steenbach were working through in the 20s and 30s as they were trying to get this process out to market and to actually commercialize this process? Well, I have a few quotes from several of the trustees that I think will illustrate this. First of all, you need resources, money and scientific equipment. So George Haight, who's the president of WARF, he was the chief counsel for WARF in a lot of the Steenbach litigation. He said, it may be interesting to know that in experimental work and the securing of clinical data, the foundation and its licensees have carefully spent well in excess of $1 million. This is $1 million, obviously, in 1920s and 30s dollars, not today. In abundance of caution, we maintain 10 laboratories throughout the United States to check the licensees' products. I don't think all those 10 laboratories are owned by WARF. Some of them were, but I think they were contracting to different industrial laboratories that were testing that. So this was actually made at the 10th anniversary celebration for WARF about 80 years ago. Fortunately, I have a picture of Billy Keys, as he was known. He was one of the alumni. He was the New York alumni and actually did a lot of WARF's work out in New York. And in a magazine published in Wisconsin Alumni Magazine, he said, Dr. Steenbach is not a practical businessman, but he has vision. He knew that he had something of vital importance to the welfare of the human race. He realized the great difficulties and grave problems ahead in the commercialization of discoveries, but the professor cannot become a businessman. So this explains the dual experience that you need in order to commercialize the process, not just in science, but also in business and in law and various other things. I have the letter actually that Steenbach wrote in response to this article, and let's just say he didn't quite agree that he was not a practical businessman. He had a higher opinion of himself, but I think he's probably on balance was a little bit more accurate. This is Evan A. Evans, also didn't get a picture of him. He was a federal judge in Chicago and a legal expert on the WARF trustees. He said, more emphasis on the ethical, less emphasis on the commercial part of our activities. Success in getting contracts is no herald of the final outcome. Our faith must be in the merits of our process and our product. Our methods must be those that appeal to the ultra-idealist, the best in the medical profession. And what he was saying was that in order for us to get successful, we have to be true. We have to figure out the process. This can't be money-making. This can't be about exploiting the process. It has to be doing an actual process that will actually help people. So it explains the importance of ethics. And then finally, Timothy Brown, who is a state Supreme Court justice in Wisconsin, and he said, to tie the business management of a discovery up with legal or political restrictions would either limit the commercial success and public use of the discovery on the one hand, or would unpleasantly involve the university on the other. So he was warning against if WARF didn't get the law right, didn't get the regulations right, then it might imperil the name of the university. So I think those are 4 pretty good areas for themes to focus on that the trustees gave us: resources, expertise, ethics, and navigating the bureaucracy. But I think George Haight put it a little more dramatically when he said there must be in the inquiry the untrammeled will to learn, there must be integrity of judgment, there must be the genius for infinite detail, there must be an indefatigable industry, there must be the willingness to accept defeat hopefully, and the knowledge that all great success is builded upon a series of failures. I don't know that I delivered that quite as dramatically as he would have, but he was quite the Perry Mason type. So without any further ado, I'll turn it over to the present process of commercialization and the rest of our panel. Thanks.
Thanks, Kevin. Thanks, Kevin. That was terrific. If the panelists could come up, let's get started. Kevin Conroy's agreed to moderate for us today. Come on, sit up. Walk up. Kevin, as you know, is the president of Exact Science, terrific corporate citizen, and among the many things he does is agree to moderate panels like this. So we really appreciate his doing that today, and I'm going to turn it over to Kevin.
Welcome, everybody. It's really a pleasure to be here today within this great university, talking about the power of WARF to effectuate change from the benchtop to benefits. I don't think there could be a worthier goal than to take the science that is embedded within the university and find a way to get it to benefit people. And that's really the overarching theme today. And we have 4 really tremendously successful people to talk to us today about this. Stephanie Adamani, who's the Deputy General Counsel of WARF, she will be speaking. And then also Winslow Sargent, who's the Managing Director of S&T. Dr. Tom Grist, who's the Chair of the Department of Radiology at UW Health. And Eric Starr, who's the President and CEO of Global MRI at GE Healthcare. So the way we're going to do this is kick this off is each of the 4 speakers will take 5 minutes and give a quick overview. Some have slides, some will just speak, and then we will kick off our panel discussion. So Stephanie, please.
Thanks. Can everybody hear me okay? I can't tell if it's on or not. No?
Yeah, I need to move closer. Closer, maybe?
Or I can speak closer. Hi, I'm Stephanie Adamani, Deputy General Counsel for WARF. I've been at WARF about 9 years, so I've seen a lot of license agreements. I've worked on a lot of license agreements. And at the last session, several inventors were up here talking about the invention process. So I wanted to jump in on the details part of the last slide about commercialization, because once the discovery happens in the lab, it is disclosed to WARF, and then we have a process for looking at that and deciding whether it makes sense to patent it and hopefully find a commercial partner who will license it and take it into the marketplace. So once we decide the answer is yes, we invest resources to patent it. And then really the next phase is what I call looking for a home. So trying to find a home for that technology, thanks, closer, okay. Finding a home for that technology, where or who will the partner be to develop that technology from the very beginning to taking it to marketplace. And that is a challenge because our technologies are really varied. So we have technologies like the seasonally appropriate cranberry variety, which is developed on campus and might have some really promising attributes. We want to bring it to market, and it already exists. It is a cranberry, so maybe it needs some trialing, but it's really close to being a commercial product. Versus an example that is a little bit earlier, the pharmaceutical compound. So maybe it has efficacy results in the lab, maybe it seems safe, but there is a lot more to go before it can be a product that is prescribed to address people's health concerns. So risk, how risky is it? What is the nature of the investment needed? And what's the possible reward? Those are some of the things that we're thinking about along the way when we think about where is the best home for the technology. So I think that's a really challenging part, finding the best place. And then something that's coming up a lot is the startup company versus existing companies. So is it so early stage that it's going to have to be a startup company because existing companies aren't willing to take that risk? So there are those types of challenges, early stage, finding the best partner. And then more details, the license agreement. So once we do find the partner, we're a nonprofit supporting organization, and we're a tech transfer organization, and we want to support the university, we want to support research. So there are different types of considerations that we have when we license that a company, a for-profit company, might not have. The legal landscape might be some of the regulations regarding federally funded inventions, so non-assignability. In exclusive licenses that have federal funding, there has to be a substantial manufacture of products within the United States. So we sort of need to weave those into the landscape and into the license agreement when we do it. Some other things are reserving rights for inventors and campuses both here in Wisconsin and across the country to be able to practice those inventions in their lab for their research. So there are all kinds of things in the back in the landscape that we need to comport with and make sure that the best home includes companies that are willing to work with us and accept who we are as an organization and where these inventions come from, and then try to bring them to market. And then, of course, once we get all those hurdles passed, we found the best home, we have licensed the technology, then there's that ongoing relationship. How is it doing? So good communication, often between the investigators and between us, WARF, and the company, and just kind of updating what our expectations are, keeping aware of the hurdles with startups, making sure, or not us making sure, but trying to encourage the right team and see if we can support a funding environment in ways that we can. So those are the details that we work with. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Winslow next. Thank you.
Well, it's great to be here. And when I was asked to come back, it was such a great joy to come back because I can remember when I was a graduate student, I had an office in the Renaissance building, and so I guess that the land we are on right now is hallowed ground because this is where the Renaissance pharmacy used to be. I am a graduate of University of WARF. Is near and dear to my heart. I got my PhD here, and I also got funding via WARF, and so it's actually come full circle. I'm a WARF trustee, and it's really good to be back here. Most recently, I was a chief counsel for advocacy at the Small Business Administration, and that's where I really got to know the role that government plays with academia, with industry, and the importance of rules. And so what I want to share today is some thoughts in terms of, I'm trying to make sure that I have, well, I want to share today some thoughts of where does government play within, this ecosystem, and is government a constructive partner, or does government tip the scales? And we're asked that question all the time because, because it's funding that's involved, because government does have to play a role, and we have to make bets. I like to say that government spends more than $120 billion a year with small businesses, so that's also a big stick that government plays within this process. But I would also say that government has always played a role, right? From the founding of our country, when we think of the Commerce Clause, Article 1, Section 8, government recognized that intellectual property was property. But it was property in a different way, because if you read the Constitution, it says to promote the progress of science and useful arts by securing for a limited times, to authors and inventors the exclusive rights to their respective writings and discoveries. So government recognized that brain power is a property, but we could only keep it for a limited time, which is rare because when you think of real estate, it's based upon transaction. Of course, you got to pay your property taxes or else the government will come and take it away as well. But you own it and it's a transaction. But when you think of intellectual property, once you disclose, once you file for a patent, you own it for a limited time. And it's important to know the rules, because once you know the rules of how the patent process works, then that means that you can work within the rules. And that's where government plays, because there's a lot of discussion about Bayh-Dole, who owns what, how long they should own it for. And of course, WARF has always been strong because we could license the intellectual property that's being developed at UW-Madison. And so it's important to know those rules. I also wanted to share too that with the rules, we know that academia, most of its funding, or a large part of its funding, come from the National Science Foundation. More than $7 billion a year is granted many times to academic institutions. But when you think of NSF, they recognize that starting from discovery, you know, there are a whole bunch of programs, and so many of you, so this could be an eye chart for some, but I think that government also recognized that we just couldn't fund research. We also must have a path to get that research down the road towards commercialization. And so from translational research, we have a number of programs, whether it's the Goldie program, whether it's some of the centers, there's the SBIR STTR program, and then there's something called I-Corps, which started about 3 or 4 years ago, because we recognize that for us to get technology to a state where it can be commercializable, or for the investor to invest money, we had to have a pathway. Of course, there's always that valley of death, but that's where the transition, that's where the baton is passed to the investment community, and that's the virtuous cycle in terms of those technologies are commercialized, and of course funds go back into the federal treasury, and it's a win-win. Just in closing, I have adopted an expression that I picked up when I was at the National Science Foundation, and it says that research is the transformation of money into knowledge. If you give a researcher money, she gives you knowledge. Output is knowledge. But when you take that knowledge and then you give it to someone who's an innovation, then that knowledge, the output, is broadly defined as money or product and services. So that's a virtuous cycle. So WARF is in that position where not only does it give money for research, it also helps the commercialization process. So it's a unique entity, and I'm pleased to be part of it. Thank you.
There we go, great. All right, so I'm a diagnostic radiologist. I can't give a talk without showing images. And I'm also a physician, and I think the title of this is The Anatomy of Successful Academic Industrial Partnerships. And so as a physician, I'll talk a little bit about anatomy. Requires the brain, right? You gotta know the brain, respect the brain, the musculoskeletal system, and the heart. And these pieces of anatomy, parts of anatomy, all have analogy to what we're talking about here for successful industrial academic collaboration. So the brain is, the teams of collaborators that are smart, they have good ideas, but they also want to work together. The musculoskeletal system is the structural support, the regulatory support, the framework, and this WARF and the university help us to provide, and our attorneys are very involved with. And the heart is just a passion for common purpose. And in healthcare, it's easy for us to find that when the mission is all about improving human health. So the reason why I'm here is because of a lead WARF investigator, Chuck Mistretta. And he invented something called digital subtraction angiography that changed the course of medicine and allowed us for the first time to acquire images of the blood vessels with digital techniques. Before, we used to use film techniques, and that really limited us. And so the digital techniques allowed this entire area to be developed of interventional procedures, placement of stents, deployment of angioplasty and other devices in the blood vessels. And I came here to interview when I was interviewing for faculty spots, and I met Chuck, and I said, I could work with this guy. He is really smart. And we started working together. The image on the top is him with Dr. Sackett, a former chair of radiology, after they invented digital subtraction angiography. And the image on the bottom is him with me after we invented something very similar, only using MRI technology. And we wanted to work together. I realized he was smart, although I kid him that he's had 2 at least major inventions over his career, separated by 25 years, and they're both the same. because we applied a lot of the same techniques to MR. And what we did is we identified this way of, instead of doing a snapshot of the contrast flowing through the vessels, we identified a way of creating a movie which solved a lot of major problems. So this provided us with these 3D movies that we call 3D time-resolved imaging of contrast kinetics, and this provided us a new window to look at these things. So that's the first thing, is having that interest. So then the musculoskeletal system really provides that structure for collaboration. And that is something that WARF has been very involved in. And of course, we needed to position the hospital and clinics next to the Wisconsin Institute for Medical Research. And we, through a generous donation from our partner, GE Healthcare, after an appeal that I made to Jeff Immelt, who was the CEO of healthcare at the time, he recognized that in order to take some of our ideas from the lab and commercialize them, we needed to place physically together people from GE and from UW in order to create these new applications. And we also had to put coffee somewhere nearby. So in WIMR, the basis of WIMR is interdisciplinary science in the interdisciplinary research building. But I think GE and our colleagues at WARF and at the university recognized that it was really going to be about team science and creating these teams to work together. And so that was a very important development. It also gave us the physical space to put in complicated technology here, like the MRI PET scanner that we just installed a few months ago, which is a $6 million piece of equipment and very unusual. So we had to get the support from our leaders. Here is Rebecca Blank. I think within the first year, she went to GE and had the interaction with leaders at GE to help set up the framework that we could interact with, and that's been very helpful. Over time, that has resulted in dozens of products which have been invented here, or they've been invented at GE and validated here, and this has led in MRI to a host of different applications that we've been able to contribute to each other's success, besides the story on tricks. Over 100 patent applications, many joint inventions, licensing agreements, and licensing revenue to WARF. The third piece of anatomy here is the heart. That's pretty easy. It's a passion for a common purpose. Here, for example, is something that we're doing now. This is a patient with a CT angiogram with a dissection, a tear in the aorta, presenting with terrible pain and really limited disability. And some of the things that we're working on now with GE and our investigators, for example, this 4D flow imaging technique, well, I won't go into detail. It allows us to, for the first time, really assess flow through the cardiac cycle over time. And without our commercial partnership, we couldn't do this alone, because the technology to bring this to the clinic requires a major corporate partner that is building these scanners. So I think that is all I had. Thank you very much.
Terrific. That was terrific, Tom. So that's the UW and academic view of how technologies are developed and make it to clinical practice. The flip side of that is when you're in a business such as GE Healthcare, and it's our job to be able to take ideas like what Dr. Grish showed and bring them to institutions beyond the University of Wisconsin, but really to around the United States and around the world. We need a way to be able to capture those, commercialize them, get them regulatory cleared or approved, and bring them to market. And so the way to do that is with early collaboration, early involvement, and as Dr. Grish mentioned, either enabling by putting new technologies, new capabilities in the hands of brilliant physicists and clinicians and let them figure out how to make something of it, or take the ideas that are invented in the in a medical school environment and tap into those and bring those into the medical industry side make them robust, and make them such that they can be disseminated to other academic institutions and again, commercially around the world. And so it requires this tight integration of what we can bring as engineers and scientists, and new hardware and new software and new wetware capabilities, put those in the hands of the clinicians who could do something with that, and then be able to quickly turn that back around, bring it in-house, commercialize it, and then disseminate it. And so it's a challenge, it's an opportunity, but it really requires deep relationships, both intellectually as well as, to what Dr. Grish showed, as in the heart, having the passion on both sides to bring these new capabilities to clinical practice and to market, harnessing that and making that robust and making it happen. So it's always about, for us, it's not about whether something we invent or something that academic principal investigators invent, but it's really about taking those ideas and getting them to market as quickly as possible so that others can utilize them and others can put them into practice, especially when it's something like a medical breakthrough that can change the way that clinical care is delivered.
Well, I think that really frames the discussion for today. And why don't we follow, Eric, on your discussion and ask you, as a representative of a large global institution that has the ability to partner, collaborate with any university in the world, why University of Wisconsin, and what specific attributes do you look for, and what type of improvements would you suggest for enhancing that relationship?
So we have developments that happen right here in Wisconsin, in Waukesha and in Wauwatosa, where we advance technologies in CT imaging, MRI imaging, what Dr. Grish showed is PET-MR or PET-CT. We also have developments in ultrasound and in X-ray and in vascular and cath labs and what have you. These developments happen not only here in Wisconsin, where a lot of it's heavily concentrated, but also around the world. We collaborate with academic institutions that have particular know-how. And whether you know it or not, University of Wisconsin is a gem when it comes to capabilities, the heart, the mind, and the musculoskeletal infrastructure to actually bring those capabilities to clinical practice. And so we look for that capability, we look for that connection as well with our engineers and scientists. And fortunately, operating in Waukesha and Wauwatosa, we certainly hire a number of our engineers, physicists, and scientists right here from University of Wisconsin. So there is that natural connection that already happens because they know their alma mater, they know their capabilities, they know the professors that are there and their former colleagues or current colleagues that can actually bring good ideas into our enterprise. You also need to have the willingness to want to work with industry and academics, and certainly we have that willingness because that's the way that clinical innovation happens. The university also has to have that willingness, and certainly here at the University of Wisconsin, through WARF and other infrastructure, the MSK, there is that ability to be able to collaborate rather easily and seamlessly once an agreement is set up and structured. So I would say part of it is, one, the natural connection between our scientists, engineers, computer scientists, and the university's technical folks and clinical folks. And then two, it's really just the brilliant innovation that's already happening here in the University of Wisconsin that we would be negligent if we didn't tap into it. There's just wonderful, wonderful science happening here and translating into clinical practice that we absolutely need to work with the University of Wisconsin.
When I was a lawyer with GE Healthcare about 12 years ago, my very first project was to work on a licensing agreement with UW, and it's then that my eyes opened up to the really deep and long-standing relationship. I guess my question to you, Tom, is there's been this real strength in collaborating between the Department of Radiology and GE Healthcare. How do you think the university is doing beyond the Department of Radiology at collaborating with industry, and what do you think you could do to help broaden that? Speaking from the institution, not just your department.
Yeah, I think, and maybe this, I could elaborate a little bit on what Eric was talking about. They can work with a lot of different universities, as you said, and I think our ability to negotiate and execute the contracts is probably the single thing that challenges us both in both sides. And so I think that that process in radiology is still largely driven by personal relationships and the willingness and patience to live through a 2-year negotiation process for the last agreement that we did, which was a 10-year research agreement. And so I think that to take that beyond, outside of radiology will still require the framework, and hopefully the new investigators could learn from past successes and mistakes, but it still will require some of those personal relationships, I think, to get the so-called contract over the goal line.
And what is WARF's role, do you think, in helping to facilitate this in a broad sense, the collaboration between industry and the university?
Yeah, so WARF's role is huge, and Carl can maybe comment on this, but for example, anything that we do to reduce the not invented here syndrome, in creating intellectual property agreements that encourage collaboration, that's tough, to make sure that there are agreements set up where both parties can share their wisdom and knowledge freely. And so they have been very instrumental, like recently on some of the things we've done with CT to create an environment that reduces that tendency for an investigator to try to hold things close to the chest.
Let me ask Stephanie this question. One of the things that our company early did in a collaboration with the Mayo Clinic was to enter into a relationship where regardless of whether any intellectual property came out of it, just the collaborative process of developing a new product jointly ended up in there being a royalty. Is that something that ever occurs, even absent specific inventions that may exist within the product?
That's an interesting question. That's not something that we've done here a lot, and I'd be interested to hear the details of how that worked. But typically, it can be a very long negotiation over the intellectual property terms and the joint inventions that might come out of it. But as Tom said, these are 10-year contracts and ones that are very complex with a lot of with many inventors and a lot of people from GE. So I think we're always looking for new and innovative ways to do those, and often it's starting with a one-off, not a big master contract like what we have going on with GE.
Well, so you have a pretty cool job because you get to be a lawyer, but it also sounds like you get to be a business person too to help facilitate this collaboration. Can you kind of expand upon not only between collaborations with large companies, but how do you see your role in facilitating that collaboration that occurs?
Well, one, I have maybe the best law job ever for an intellectual property lawyer, in my opinion. But two, I work with a team at WARF. So we have licensing managers who really know their industry and have deep relationships with the scientists on campus. We have intellectual property managers who manage the portfolio and know that patent landscape. So we all work together to try to work with the company, whether it be a startup company and working around some of the needs that they have, or a really established company where we can kind of say, we've done this with you before and we know what to expect roughly, and we know we have a good line of communication open. So I think it's just making sure you have all of the right people involved in the room, and then a company that can respect that we all have the same goal. We all want to have a product on the market and success, and hopefully bettering society for it. Thanks.
Thank you, Stephanie. Winslow, so you have the unique position of having gotten a PhD and been in the academic setting, going out and being part of a hyper-successful startup, going to work for the federal government, being on the investor side. You're kind of a man of all seasons. How do you think, with kind of an external view, we, the entrepreneurial community, industry, WARF, and the federal government can kind of work together to improve kind of the output, the commercialization output of this gem that we have here?
That's a very good question, and that's a question that we continue to try to answer, because, as you know, as I said, with regard to moving this knowledge into money, that means that there are so many roles that must be played, right? And it means that we have to understand the rules and the regulations of who owns the technology, how will this technology be deployed. When you think of, if you're working with FDA, there may be a 510K process, there could be a lengthy process. So any clarity that we can get in terms of how to move knowledge to the marketplace is, if we can shorten that process, we need to do that, because the time that it takes to move something to the marketplace, it takes money, right? And for those who need to get some type of FDA approval, that means that they can't sell their product or service. And quickly what will happen is that they'll just run out of money. And so what we're always trying to balance is safety, making sure that what we put into commercialization or into the marketplace is safe. But we also have to wrestle with, how do we make sure that the entrepreneur, working alongside with the government, working alongside with those in academia, we're doing all the necessary steps to make sure that that the process can be shortened in a timely manner and most efficiently, because we spend so much money on research. At some point, we have to find a way to commercialize it, and that's where the rules, and that's where we continue to look for ways to shorten that cycle, because that's how we turn this knowledge back into money.
And where do you think the federal government has gotten it right, and where do you think, I mean, if you could change anything about the federal government's regulations or legal framework, what would it be?
Well, I think that there's a lot of emphasis these days to make the federal government work. But the challenge with technology is, when you think about it, 10 years ago, for a medical device, it was mostly made out of widgets. But nowadays, you may have some wireless involved in that medical device. So those who may oversee, let's say, the 510K process, may not have a spectrum background. So now what you're seeing is not these silos anymore. You're seeing, we're seeing these technologies that pull from here, pull from there, and there's very few people that can assess how they should work. And there are government agencies that may have dealt with spectrum, but now they have to weigh into medical devices. So one of the things that I did when I was in government, I went and talked to folks at FDA and said, we got to shorten this process, because I keep hearing from those who are trying to get their products into the marketplace that they can't, and it's causing great heartache. And he explained to me that they don't have the people or trained or skilled enough to really do an assessment in a timely manner. And also, government does not get kudos for doing things fast, because if you do things fast, that's not something that government will get kudos for. But if there's 1 out of 1,000 that slips through and it causes harm, then of course you're going to be on the front page of the Wall Street Journal, and no one wants to be on the front page of the Wall Street Journal. So that's the balance that government has to play.
And you don't get on the front page of the Wall Street Journal by getting something done fast?
No.
Eric, let's step out of your relationship with UW and speak to other collaborations that you have. What are some of the hallmarks of successes that you have had through collaboration? And if you could just, as context, provide kind of what percentage of your new products or innovations come from collaborations versus totally internally developed?
Yeah. So I currently lead our MRI business, and I would say MRI is particularly unique in this, and like most all of the innovations that make it to product in MRI have had some root in invention and collaboration at a university setting or with a university and an industry partner. And so there are many examples outside of our collaborations with UW. We've got a long history with Stanford University, with UCSF, with a number of other institutions around the U.S. and around the world. But I think the thing that you want to, the thing that sustains them is not the one-off event where there's an inventor and we license technologies. We've certainly done that too. But the thing that really sustains, I think, the most prolific, productive relationships are, again, the natural connection between the investigators and our engineers and scientists. And so certainly Dr. Grist mentioned earlier that fostering an environment where you don't have the non-invented here, or you have the, should I really share this information? The long-standing partnerships that really excel are those where there's a free flowing of information back and forth, which is, bolstered by some agreement behind that allows that. But more importantly, a certain trust between an investigator and industry to be able to share that information freely, and all focusing on the one goal, which is to make it out there in product and in clinical practice. So I mean, we have many examples, but again, one of the best, if not the best, is sitting right here.
One of the things that I think that we all think about in terms of WARF and the UW is this is an unbelievable economic engine. And it's an economic engine that we have seen bear tremendous fruit. So we see it have a big impact in terms of patients and eradicating rickets, right? And then all the ancillary uses of vitamin D. So there are just a countless number of innovations embedded within UW. How big, and I'll just put this to the panel, how big of a problem is a lack of capital? Wisconsin is a state without a lot of venture capital. How big of a problem is it really that our entrepreneurs within the university, unlike at Stanford, unlike at MIT, can walk out the front door and go and talk to a dozen venture capital firms? How big of is that as an impediment to WARF's future success and UW's future success?
Yes.
If you could wave a magic wand, what would you do?
I think it is a big problem, and I have some colleagues in the audience that are familiar with this problem. That have some great inventions, great technology, but just having the access to that capital is a problem. Now, I'm not a finance guy. I don't know how to fix that exactly, except moving. Once real estate gets too expensive in Palo Alto, maybe Madison will be the place to be.
Are there policy, to anybody on the panel, are there policies that could change at a state level, at the university level with WARF? What could we do to enhance the ability of these unbelievable entrepreneurs or scientists to become entrepreneurs?
I think that WARF has been very progressive in terms of looking for ways to move those technologies to the marketplace. There's 4429, is that? 4490, that fund. There are the lead optimization programs. There's the Merlin Mentors. There are a number of programs that are here to help. But I do agree in terms of capital, because it takes money to make money, and the capital helps to keep people in business while they're trying to figure it out. And especially when you're in the medical sciences where, once again, we have to deal with regulation. In IT, for example, you can only ship buggy software and send a patch, right? You can't do that in medicine. That's a no-no. So that means that you have to get it right, and it's much more challenging. And so it all depends upon the industry that you're in terms of how much capital that you need. And because we're focusing on health sciences, I think that it's important that we have more capital.
One additional comment that I have is in my area, I think this region, we are probably one of the world's most dynamic areas for like the imaging technology development. But we have this Midwestern approach, which is, oh, shucks, gosh, very modest in general. And so I think what results is our legislature doesn't know how impactful this is to the state's economy. And I think the people in Wisconsin don't know how impactful this is to many people in Wisconsin. And I think we need to get the word out.
Thank you. And this is something that there have been a lot of speakers. I think Tom Still locally has driven this message home that when you take a look at the data, 100% of all net job creation in the U.S. over the last 35 years has come from startups. All of it. If you look at it, all of it comes from brand new companies on a net basis, because older companies tend to shed more jobs than they hire. So I guess now I turn it over to the audience. What questions do you have for the esteemed panel here? And there's a microphone here.
Hi, I'm Joanne Orevic from UW-Whitewater. I've got a couple questions about postdocs and graduate students, and perhaps we could even throw staff members in it as well. One of the ways that a great university produces information is utilizing the best talents of postdocs and grad students and staff and all that. And I'm wondering what industry and what government looks for in terms of productive and healthy relationships between faculty and these other groups and entities such as postdocs and graduate students. Are there any indices that would make a university toxic in terms of how it deals with these individuals who perhaps don't have their names on papers in the full way that a professor would, or their names on patents the way that a professor would, but definitely contribute to those outcomes? Again, are there ways to make these relationships more healthy so that no one's exploited?
That's a good question. I think the postdocs, graduate students, trainees, in our case, are all on the papers and patents. So they are included if they contribute intellectually. So I'm not sure I have experience where one would be excluded. I think the key is managing conflicts of interest for faculty who may have a startup and who are doing research in areas that maybe the graduate student is also doing research in something related. And that requires careful management of the conflict of interest with management plans, things like that. And that can be quite complicated.
I guess that I would weigh in terms of, there's a program that I mentioned at the National Science Foundation called I-Corps. I don't know, how many of you have heard of I-Corps or know of I-Corps? Great. Well, there's a few in the audience. That's a great program because what it does is it gives funding to faculty members to help them to commercialize their technology. Now, they don't have to start a company. They can work with their postdocs. But the rationale behind the funding is to make customer calls, is to really get a sense of where is this technology in the marketplace. And so I could see postdocs and graduate students working with faculty to assess the marketplace, to make calls to customers, to really understand that ecosystem that they need to function in case they go out and start a company.
Any other questions at all? Yes.
So one at the table, we have Stephanie, who's got a lot more ideas to license than there are people to license who wind up licensing them. And at the other end, we have Eric, who's one of those people who sort of says, Thanks, Stephanie. I'll take a pass on that one. So you're, Eric, in the business of mediating this sense of ideas and what the marketplace will or will not absorb. Can you say a bit more about that and what experiences you've been about, like great ideas, but they didn't make it, you can't see them making in the marketplace?
Yeah. Well, certainly there's some that just don't fit in our space and our core expertise. So we get many more ideas than what we're even in the business to take to market. And so you have to politely say, great idea, we're not in that business today. Here are others who are in that business. You may do yourself a disservice by having us bring this in more than finding someone who's got that as their core capability and what it is that they're trying to do as an entity. And so we're as big as we think we are also very small when it comes into the whole medical landscape. So the first thing is we got to make sure that it's something that actually fits with what we do and something that we think we can actually take to market. The other one is, there's great ideas that have very little data. And unfortunately, what kind of makes it with the FDA and some of the other regulatory agencies is you really got to back it up with real data. And so the more data you come with when presenting an idea, the better chance it has of being taken into either a startup or a mid-sized company or a company of our size. Really having the claims backed up with good science and good data certainly helps foster that speed to market.
Oh, please.
We've seen some trends where companies maybe that are far ahead. For example, pharmaceutical companies aren't so interested in the early stage compounds anymore. But I think that's where the startup opportunities are. So startups, they're high risk, potentially high reward, but if they can move it along enough to get a larger company interested, that seems to be a trend. And then the key is having a lot of those, so more fish in the stream, so to speak.
We have time for one more question right here.
You have to, so the question is the balance between research and the startup. So if you want to start a startup, meaning you have to start from small, then you get bigger, versus research, you dive deep. So how am I gonna balance?
Well, most of the funding these days, I think they ask two questions, right? They ask, what are the merits in terms of the technology, but also what are the broader impacts? So even though you may be doing basic research, you have to also answer the question, well, what could be the use of this technology or the discovery down the road? And so at some point you should think, okay, that if I solve this problem here, maybe down the road this may be a solution to this problem. And so it's not that you have to think about startups from the beginning, but you should at least think about how will this impact, how will it impact the broader impacts? And so that's what we're saying. Well, that's what I'm saying.
So I have one ending question for the audience. How many people in the audience would like to become an entrepreneur? There we go. This is the solution right here. Stephanie, get her telephone number. I'd like to just thank the entire panel for coming today. It was a really terrific presentation. Thank you very much. There will be an informal networking reception immediately following, right outside here. Terrific. Thank you very much. Thanks, Laura, for organizing.